Hi, I'm Wale.
And I'm Rudy, and we're here to talk to you about everything IoT. In today's episode, we're going to talk about AWS IoT Greengrass, specifically provisioning for production. So everyone, get ready for IoT All the Things.
So Tim, just want to give a little bit of background about what you're working with. I think you have some kind of great partners in your space that you kind of get to dive in with in IoT.
Yeah. So I'm a principal partner solutions architect. So I focus on building solutions with partners. Primarily, I work in the edge compute space, and I've been working with Greengrass since 2017. I started my career a long time ago as a firmware engineer, which is how I got interested in IoT and connected devices. So, 20 years later, showing my age, this is where I am.
Is it 20 years like my T-shirt 20 years? So, I had to throw it back to a bit of He-Man.
Yeah, 20 years since my first embedded development job. So still interested in this kind of stuff after all that time. And I've been working with a lot of partners, like I said, building edge compute solutions. And through that, I've been spending a lot of time figuring out how to streamline that, improve the processes, help partners, build out their production systems. And that's what we're going to talk about today with the Greengrass Provisioner.
Sweet. And I know in our last episode, we did a lot of stuff on industrial. So, as Rudy mentioned in the opening, we're going to dive into Greengrass, especially provisioning Greengrass. And, from there, we'll get into everything from automation to debugging. So, Tim, I'd love to just dive into that first use case. You mentioned coming from that embedded developer background, all the coding is about the developer experience, how you build something, how you code it, how you make changes. So it'd be really cool to get your sense of like how you're able to get that experience when you work with your partners, especially with Greengrass.
Sure. So again, starting out as a firmware engineer back in the day, everything was C and assembly language, and everything was incredibly manual. So I've got a real aversion to anything that I can't automate or somehow improve to make sure that somebody doesn't have to do all the same work that I did in the past. And with Greengrass, I know we have some content here that can show the Greengrass configuration coming up. But Greengrass has a lot of different things to configure. And what I was really working towards was, as we were doing workshops for partners, showing them how to use Greengrass, showing them how the edge compute platform worked, I just wanted a way for them to get started really quickly. All of the features in Greengrass, they're all necessary, but in order to get started, you only need a small subset of them. So I focused on that first, and then expanded it out to turn into a product that now we know that multiple customers are using in production, both internal and external.
Cool. So I know what I think is really interesting, along with working with partners, is, as you mentioned, that developer experience that kind of got you started down the how do you make AWS Greengrass easier. So it would be great to, kind of talk about the service AWS Greengrass and things that you're working with and figuring out in terms of, how do you create that rich developer experience?
Sure. Yeah, so a lot of partners start out just kind of curious what AWS Greengrass is about, and they think, oh, maybe we can take some of our code and ship it down to the edge, and they build these things inside Lambda functions, and they want to just have a way to quickly iterate on what they're doing. And to me, that's what it's all about. It's about the velocity of the developer. You need to be able to write some code, iterate it, test it, and once you've built up a framework for that, you can be incredibly productive. So the Greengrass Provisioner specifically gives people the ability to streamline that first initial bootstrapping process, and then modify their code on the fly really quickly, and debug, as we'll see later.
Cool. So, what I think is really interesting is when we dive into Greengrass, there's so many different moving components, and we have a special guest that looks like as well. So,
This is
not a Greengrass.
This is Gulu, and she really loves Greengrass. She was like, I heard about AWS IoT Greengrass, and I had to just come and give everyone a taste of my presence.
That is awesome. I'm curious. It seems like the cat is actually ready to code. So, Tim, is the Greengrass provisioning as easy as a cat to use? Like, how do you kind of get all these components together?
So, Again, Greengrass, the edge compute platform, at the highest level, it's a process that runs on a Linux box. And, there's a few different high level components, like the thing that you need to create in the registry. And then there's a group definition and the Lambda functions. And if you want, you can use machine learning assets. But each one of these things requires a few steps to set up. If you want to set up an IoT thing, you need a certificate and a policy. And for Greengrass, you need a role alias. And the group definition has all of these different 6 components that define which devices can connect to it, what kind of functions you're going to run, what access to local resources those functions have, how those functions are wired together, if you want to use any of our pre-built functions, which are called connectors. And all of those things have not only a definition, but a version behind them. So as you're modifying things, you're having to create new versions and kind of roll up all of the different configuration into these objects. So it can take a lot of steps to get that definition done. And then even once you've got that, you've got to build the Lambda functions. And if your Lambda function is simple and doesn't have a whole lot of dependencies, you may be able to just edit in the console and deploy there. But the provisioner takes care of, packaging up your dependencies, shipping them up to Lambda. So your deployment really ends up being one step after you go through the framework that we've put around it. And the same thing with machine learning. If you've built machine learning models and you want to ship them down to the edge, the provisioner will let you reference those and bring them into your Lambda functions so that you can have a machine learning model as big as you'd like, packaged alongside your functions, so it'll just show up in Greengrass.
Awesome. And I think it's interesting because when people think about Greengrass, it's all about how can you run things at the edge, right? So you take all these components together, you want to run them at the edge. And then Tim, to your point, the work you've been doing with the Greengrass provisioner is all about, how can you make all these pieces come together quicker? So what kind of other benefits have you seen from going down the path to provisioning Greengrass, as easy as a cat to use with the toy? That's what you say.
Yeah, I think when we first started this whole thing, it started out as just a big bash script that would go through and wire this stuff up for people. But then as we were seeing, we wanted to do these workshops with partners and just streamline the process of that. And we wanted to build more on top of the higher order functions, more in-depth Lambda functions. We want to bring machine learning models into it. And we were just seeing that, it all required more and more automation just to get people to that start where, if you're only there for 2 hours, 4 hours, maybe, you don't have the luxury of going through and wiring everything up manually. So we keep adding more automation as new features come out. We want to just find ways to hook things up that are kind of like what I refer to as just the same defaults to make sure that, people don't have to do too much manual work. And granted, all that flexibility exists in the configuration if you have a really advanced configuration that maybe the provisioner doesn't necessarily cover. But for the majority of use cases and getting started, this is what we see. And I find in working with partners, you can point somebody to the documentation of anything, but any type of technology today is going to take quite some time to just get spooled up on and kind of wrap your head around how it works. And it's really satisfying to just be able to go into a partner engagement and just give them a working model and sit down with them and just in a few hours be able to iterate and show them, okay, now we've gone through 10, 15, 20 changes, and now we've got something that's kind of doing what you think, and get them started on the path. And I find that projects that start out that way are a lot more successful. Many more of them, get all the way to completion and then move into production when you can provide tools like that to simplify things.
Awesome. And I know to dive in a little bit more with the Greengrass provisioner, you do all of this through deployment configuration. So could you kind of speak about how that allows you the flexibility to kind of get Greengrass up and running?
Yeah, sure. So in the previous graphic we were looking at, there's all the different elements that you could configure. But when I started thinking about at the highest level what somebody needs to build a Greengrass deployment, really what they're looking is how can I deploy functions at the edge? So there's a simple file that's up on the screen now called the deployment configuration, and it has a lot of other options. But right now it's set. All the other options are just excluded because we're using the defaults. But it starts out with just a list of the functions you want to deploy. And in this case, this is the Hello World Python 3 function. So the provisioner you point it to a configuration file, deployment configuration. It goes through and it looks and says, these are the functions you'd like to run. And then it goes and it finds those functions in the directory. And each one of those functions has its own configuration, which gives you the ability to specify what the function does and how it's built and how it's wired up.
Cool. So you start with maybe in your first configuration, just a simple function example. But as you mentioned, if you actually have the full function config file, you can add a lot more variables to this. So that gives you a little bit more, let's say, insight into, again, still not having to code. So there's this like kind of next set of configurations that you can actually run for partners that kind of keeps it hands off.
Yeah, the function configuration is going to specify the name of the function, where the function handler is, the type of the function, whether it's event-driven or whether it's a pinned function, which means that it's running all the time. And then it's going to specify something that's kind of unique to the provisioner. It's going to specify the inputs and outputs of the function. Like, what topics do I want this function to listen to, which is really important because that helps the provisioner decide how to automatically wire up functions for each other. There's this notion of the subscription definition in Greengrass. And what that does is that says this function can talk to this function on these topics. And normally you have to create a function, it listens on, or it expects a message on a topic. You create another function that sends messages on the topic, and then you create an entry that wires those together. But through this, declarative configuration, what we've said is just tell me what those topics are, and I will then go through automatically and wire those functions up for you. Now, there may be some cases where people don't necessarily want all of those functions wired together, but again, this is kind of the default that we've heard partners say. This is the way I've built my functions. This is the way I expect them to be wired up. So this is just, again, convenient shorthand to get things moving.
Cool. So through this method, you basically can do the function names, aliases, kind of allocate how long a function can run, and as you mentioned, all the inputs and outputs. So it seems like just through this process, you're able to just deploy all the parts of Greengrass in that earlier slide, like you talked about. So this is super interesting. I'd love to actually see how all of this works. Like, how does provisioning actually work with your Greengrass provisioner in AWS? So it'd be cool to just get a little bit deeper and actually maybe test out the provisioning flow right now for the group.
So there's a repository I built called the Greengrass Lambda functions, which are kind of the example functions that we use in workshops and show to partners. And in it is a script called ggp.sh. And here I'm simply saying, use the Python 3 hello world configuration. That's the -D for the deployments option. Create a group called Twitch, because we're on Twitch. And then this is one of the really convenient options, is EC2 launch. And you tell it whether you want Ubuntu or Amazon Linux, the two options today. Now, what's going to happen here is a lot of things are going to scroll past on the screen very quickly. We'll be able to talk as there are a couple of pauses, but you'll get to see each one of these things is a step that you would normally go through manually as you go through and do the provisioning. So the first thing it'll do is it's going to set up all the roles, set up all the permissions to make sure that your functions can run, that your Greengrass device can communicate with the cloud, all the subscriptions. And then you'll see here now it's creating the EC2 instance. It's creating that bootstrap script, which is called gg.twitch.sh. It's letting the Greengrass deployment finish, and now it's in a state where it's just waiting for that EC2 instance to start. Once the EC2 instance starts, this is where the real automation comes in. It's going to copy that script over to the EC2 instance. It's then going to start the script, which bootstraps the EC2 instance to have all the dependencies it needs for Greengrass. And then Greengrass is going to start, and then the deployment mechanism is going to take over, download our functions, and start everything. So, and probably let's get into the instance here, and in probably I would say 2 minutes we'll be able to see that this is running. So when it finishes, it tells you the username and the IP address that you should connect to. It uses your SSH keys, so you'll be able to connect right in. And as we resume the screen, you'll see these are all the dependencies that we have to bring in. And again, Provisioner is designed to make sure that it brings in everything so that any user that wants to use a feature of Greengrass is going to be able to have it. So it brings in Python 2, Python 3, Node.js 12, which is the version we expect. It brings in the Java runtime. It brings in MXNet, OpenCV, NumPy, SciPy, all these different things. Since we added the Docker support, it brings in everything. And actually, if you run it on a Raspberry Pi, there's some special code in there that includes libraries for the Raspberry Pi GPIO and things like that. So it's smart enough where that deployment script will kind of detect the environment that you're running in, and if it's on EC2, it'll make sure it puts in the dependencies that make sense there. And if it's on a Raspberry Pi or some other local device, it'll include those libraries that it needs as well. A lot of the Raspberry Pi functions depend on the GPIO functions, and if you don't install them here, then a lot of those functions won't work. But yeah, probably got a couple more libraries to go. Probably going to install Node.js in a minute here, and then we'll get to see it start up.
But yeah, in the end, all the things.
All the things. And again, not everybody's going to need every single dependency, but this is just to make sure that if we're doing a workshop and somebody says, hey, I want to write a Java function, hey, I want to write a Node.js function, that they can do it. They can just deploy any one of those examples and they'll all work out of the box. And if they want to use the Docker connector that we have to launch Docker containers, there's examples for that as well. This is going to install Docker. Docker that's compatible with EC2, and again on Raspberry Pi, it installs the Docker version for Raspberry Pi that works. So think of this as me sat down for months and months and months and said, okay, here's all of the things I've learned about Greengrass, and I've just distilled them into this application. And now, once it's done doing all those dependencies, what we see here is that the application has been following the Greengrass logs. And we're seeing that it pulled down that first function. That was the Hello World 3. It's a little bit difficult to see here with so many things popping up. But the important thing is the Hello World Python function, what it does is every 5 seconds, it just wakes up and sends a Hello World message just to let you know that everything's working. And here what we see is when you see that message, it says handled functions request that's coming up every 5 seconds. That is the function itself that's running. So right now, we have a Greengrass group that's fully configured. We have the roles that are fully set up. We have the AWS CLI, Boto 3, all the libraries you need to do development on this box. And it's all running on EC2 just so you can test it out. And you could move this to a physical device by doing the same thing and just pointing it to a different host. But sub 5 minutes, we've got something working that we can start iterating on. The philosophy that I've got is that I want to include everything so that anybody who wants to get started with any feature, any function that's in that Greengrass Lambda functions repository, they'll be able to use this and build their system and run any of those functions. Now, I've done a lot of work with partners that want to build what they call the golden image, that has their particular type of Linux flavor and has the dependencies that they need to run their application. And they usually start with the script. It's just called update dependencies. And then they make sure their application works, and they slowly pull things out and then rebuild and redeploy until they have a minimal configuration. So we've gone through that with a bunch of partners. And again, it's really helpful to just know that whatever you build is going to work when you use the default script, and then it's up to you. You can pull those things out as you don't need them. If you're not using Node.js, you're not using Java, you can just pull those things out and get rid of them. If you don't need the AWS CLI, you can get rid of that as well. If you just want the device to just be running Greengrass only.
Okay, sweet. So it gives you a little bit of control. Like you mentioned, you start with everything, but then it gives you some control on like what you can end up doing. So it seems like you're also able to just automate some of these changes as well to the Greengrass provisioner. So you're able to do kind of quick changes in terms of like how you like maybe modify something and then get it running via your Greengrass provisioner.
Yeah, this is the console here, by the way, that shows us the messages coming out of this Greengrass group. And I'm just going to subscribe to that Twitch core topic, and you'll see these messages popping up here. So these are the Hello World messages. Just double extra proof that it worked for you.
Nice. At least you have to prove it too, as well. So you got to kind of put the money where your mouth is, so to speak, when it comes to that.
Yeah. So I mean, the next thing we can do is modify it, so you can see on the screen here that this, we can make a change to these messages, and then we can see how fast somebody can make those changes and then redeploy. And the nice thing about doing the redeployment is that, whether you built your Greengrass group or whether you built your image with the provisioner or not, you can always go in and you can take a Greengrass group, you can modify its configuration with this tool. You don't have to copy any scripts to it. You can use the Greengrass deployment mechanism to just deploy new functions to it. Which is really handy. Once you've built something locally and then you ship it off and put it in the field, you just rerun these scripts and they will use the deployment mechanism, so you don't need to have a direct connection to it. You don't need to be on the same network as it. And again, in that repository, we have a lot of different examples, and we're always adding examples based on, customer feedback. Like I want to see how to do, I want to see how to run a web server inside Node.js, or I want to see how to control my light with Greengrass. We have a lot of examples like that people can kind of dig into once they get past Hello World. Hello World's very convenient, so we can go through and modify things without having a bunch of other hardware dangling around. It's good for testing on EC2.
With the with the way you're doing the provisioning and that, it's nice to see that you can start doing everything in a manual way, get everything up and running, and then actually go towards automation. So I think
Right.
it's stuff that we see every day where you want to actually automate it, because those manual steps with human intervention, you never know what might go wrong. Not to say that it will. And
Yeah.
one other thing is that I'll say is uh, I would ask, can you go into that in a bit more detail with regard to the automation piece?
Yeah.
Whether you building it in, how you updating code in the maybe the continuous integration and whatnot.
Sure, yeah. So I've been looking a lot. I've had some customer requests specifically for these production systems where they have, 50, 60, 100 different Greengrass devices on site, and they want to update them all. And I've been trying to figure out the best pattern that I could support that customer and then customers down the road. And I've been working very closely with them on it. But what they have today is really interesting. It's they have a CI system, and they do a bunch of local testing. They have a bunch of tests that, unit tests on their Python code. And then what they use, they don't use the provisioner to do that initial bootstrapping, but they use the provisioner to then take their test lab and then, deploy everything to their test lab. They have CI then check to make sure that everything is working. And then they do something that I think is pretty clever. What they do is they take the identities of the devices in the field that they want to be able to provision to. They put the information about those devices in an SQS and they have the provisioner running as a Lambda function in their account, and it simply pulls out the next device to provision, which might be in another country, who knows, could be anywhere in the world, pulls out the next device to provision, does the automatic provisioning, and then checks in with the device once it's done to make sure that it's working. And then every time they launch a device that's working in the field, then they pull out the next one just to make sure that they don't, by blanket do that. But we've seen a lot of partners do patterns like that, where they have a queue of devices that they want to provision, and they just use the provisioner to push off those configurations. And in this case, this particular partner, they build everything for their production version. They build everything through their CI pipeline, and the provisioner lets them actually just point to the functions that they've built instead of building everything on its own. So it's got a lot of flexibility. It can build everything for you, including the bootstrapping scripts. It can build the functions for you. It can use functions that you've already got deployed. There's a lot of different ways that you can use it, and it's just it's continuously evolving as customers and partners say that they have a different way that they want to operate with it. But I think that tying it into a CI pipeline is something I'm seeing happen a lot more now.
And do you have an example for us that you could show us?
Yeah, let's go in and let's modify the existing code there. So the function that I had here was just this Python hello world. It's a standard one from our SDKs. And there's one section of it where we publish a message, and you see above the message here. I'll move down so you can see the timer. This runs every 5 seconds. This message here says hello world sent from the Greengrass Core from Python. If I just go in and just say, hey, I made some changes. I'll try not to break the...
Don't brick it.
Don't break it, yeah. Very hard to brick it, but so all I need to do is, this is on my local system. So I make these changes, I save them, and I run the provisioner again. Same command line I ran before, but instead of telling it to launch the instance, I just tell it the name of the group. And the provisioner is smart enough to go and look and see, hey, that group already exists. It's going to go through the same process it went before, but it's going to say the group already exists. Let's just create a new configuration for it with the new code. And you'll see it actually happens a lot faster now because it's not launching the EC2 instance as well. When it gets down to this section that says the deployment's being built, when it gets out to the console after that, the deployment's successful. Right now, the code is being pushed to that Greengrass group. And what we can do is we can bring up the console we were subscribed to, and then you'll see that those messages change. And this is what I was talking about earlier, is that the rapid iteration. My feeling is that, coming again from that embedded background where sometimes it takes 5 hours to build your code, I want to be able to see things change very, very quickly. So you get in there, you make some changes, and within 30 seconds, depending on which language you're using and depending on how big your functions are, you can see that reflected in the console directly. And that's very, very helpful. Sometimes you want to make changes and just iterate and play around with things, or sometimes you really need to fix a bug quickly, so you can get in there and do that in less than a minute. So this is the console we were at before. Subscribe to those same topics, and you can see here this happened a little bit ago, but this is hey, I made some changes. And again, just proof that the system is taking those changes really, really quickly. And if you get started with this, you will be able to make changes within a minute, 2 minutes. And if you want, we can go into some of the debugging features as well.
I'd love to. I mean, in all fairness, we've got a lot of developers on the stream, and they'd love to see how you actually debug what's going on in your infrastructure, and in this case, Greengrass.
Yeah. So what the provisioner does by default is it's going to set up all of the loggings of the local file system. But as I was saying, when your device is deployed in the field, you may not be able to SSH to it directly. So it also sets up the CloudWatch logging. And we've added some features to it that you could go into CloudWatch logs yourself in the console, and you can go and you can find the different messages. But what we heard from the people in the workshops was, I like using the Unix utilities like tail. I just want to be able to watch the logs in my console. So the provisioner's got this feature. It's called Query Group, and you can do a bunch of different things to get information about the group. But the Query Group option has something called Watch Logs. And what Watch Logs does is it goes to the CloudWatch logs, and it finds your group name automatically for you, and then it pulls out all of the log messages and tags them and tells you, this is a runtime log message, this is a log message from your function. And with something like that, you can very easily see what's going on in your group.
If you had to describe the general process of what you're doing with debugging in this case, Tim, how would you say that to our viewers, this is where you'd get started with debugging?
Sure. Yeah, so in general, that watch logs feature will let you just scroll the logs and just monitor what's going on. And then once you get a sense maybe of where something's going wrong, the easiest thing to do, quickly modify your code, do a redeploy, and then start going through the logs again. Now, sometimes you've got a lot of logs coming out. Maybe you have like 10 Lambda functions running, and the logs are,
Sure.
There's a lot of different data coming out. So with the watch logs feature, it's just a Unix command. You can just pipe it through grep, and you can just search for whatever you want. So in my case, I might put in a tag that says, this is the section that I'm debugging. I can say, section A, section B, something like that. And I can just do a grep for section and just have those messages come up. I can watch all the messages as well if I want. But you can always use that feature to do that. And again, it uses CloudWatch logs, so you can go back into the console and find those messages later. But the fact that you can have it directly in your console or directly in your terminal, where you're probably doing your deployments from in the first place, just speeds everything up. So you don't need to think about it too much. And going into the CloudWatch logs console, it's not really that hard. But anytime, again, we can remove a step for somebody to do. You don't have to open up your browser and navigate away from your terminal. If you can do it all in one place, it just increases people's development velocity, is what I would say, being able to do that.
So our tip and trick, we've got two, because we've been diving into provisioning. The first tip trick is to check out fleet provisioning. So I'll just bring up a quick view of where you can find that on AWS. But for fleet provisioning, the thing that's really cool is that this allows you to use what's called a claim certificate to onboard devices. With the tip, some best practices if you use fleet provisioning, it comes with a pre-hook Lambda. So use Lambda to whitelist which devices you have, so you can actually do some more validation checks. We also recommend that you, for fleet provisioning, just make sure you have like a scaled down IoT policy. But if you're looking for a way to get started onboarding your devices and you use claim certificates, definitely check out fleet provisioning as our part one of tips and tricks. And then for our part two for tips and tricks all around provisioning is multi-account registration. So what's really cool with multi-account registration is that back in the day when you created a cert, as Tim kind of showed in his example of bootstrapping Greengrass, it could only live in one AWS account. But with multi-account registration, you can take a certificate and then register it in multiple accounts without requiring the CA. So 2 things to check out: fleet provisioning and multi-account registration are 2 tips and tricks.
Thanks for joining us, Tim. It's been fun. I mean, honestly, we've learned a lot with Greengrass. You've shown our viewers how they can get going with the provisioner, automate some of their stuff as well. Is there anything you want to leave our viewers with?
Yeah, I would say, just Google the AWS Greengrass Provisioner, AWS Greengrass Lambda Functions. There's 2 repositories: AWS Samples, AWS Labs. And if there's anything you see that doesn't make sense, or it's not working for you, or you want to just contribute, open up some issues and let's write some code.
Awesome. Well, as always, thanks for coming, Tim. And I'll say, he's Wale, he's Tim, I'm Rudy, and you've been watching IoT
All the things.
things.